Welcome back. We are here again for another reading of Walking on Cinders. And if you think I'm looking a little bit peaky, you've caught me just after doing my Joe Wicks workout. P with Joe Wicks for today, which is Monday, the something of April. Days are all blending into one. 6th of April. There we go. Just done my workout. So, gosh, I'd have to do it after a day of work rather than before. But very good, very good. So go and check them out if you want to do a few exercises at home. Joe Wicks is a great guy for doing that. So we're on chapter 13 now of my novel Walking on Cinders. This is to celebrate the 10th anniversary. Remember, the novel came out in May of 2010. I wrote it when I was 18, and I decided that due to the isolation that we're currently all going through, that I would read a chapter of this every night at 6 p.m. And we are on chapter 13 now, 13 days going strong. So here we go. There is a pool of water high on a mountain, which overlooks the valleys below. The mountain is not high. It forms part of a range that stretches round in a great circle. The views from the tallest peaks are spectacular, while the water from the pool is clear and clean. Thomas was not at all surprised when, during the evening that followed their encounter with Lieutenant Beerchamp, Chris had suggested they leave the old man before dawn the following morning. During the night they had taken refuge in a dark room at the back of the cottage. The walls were crumbling and there was a strong smell of damp. The ground was hard and they did not sleep well, but it was shelter and protection from the elements after all. But Chris was not foolish, and if his experience had taught him anything, it was that reformed skirmishers would soon search an area meticulously and with great caution if there was any reason for them to do so. He continually worried that the alarm had been raised since their escape from the wreckage, and that someone knew they were missing. Thomas thought so too. He had been posted overseas with Chris several times in the last year, and had studied his friend closely. He had learned that his comrade was always precise in his approach, and that he preferred to work alone. Thomas often wondered if Chris was lonely, if this hard outer shell hid some emotion within that even Chris dared not to do battle. By the time morning really did arrive, the grass was wet with the dew, and the pair were far into their journey towards the French barracks. They had headed out past the cottage, covering the fields that lay beyond, and walking up and down the hills that followed. For a while, the landscape was rich with vegetation. They avoided those places where crops had been set, but walked slowly through the pathways made in great towers of barley, glad of the cover that it provided. Time passed slowly for Chris and Thomas, as it had done on previous days, with only long periods of walking and no way of telling the time. They were left to chart the passage of the sun across the sky, noting when it reached the second quarter that afternoon had arrived. At lunch they ate plentifully. It was not the best food, Lieutenant Beerchamp being no Michelin star chef, but it filled the longing pit in their stomachs. They gradually started to notice changes in the landscape. The fields gave way to rockier ground, and soon they came upon a huge drop in the land, the edge of a hill that led down towards a flat and barren plain. Beyond that, mountains rose up in the distance. As they made for the mountains, they saw they were not tall peaks, snowy tops, or rocky crevices. These were green and round in shape, looming up large above the empty plain. From where they stood, the drop seemed impossible, yet both men knew this was their only way forward, for there, nestled at the base of the green peaks, towards the middle of the plain, was a mass of square buildings arranged in an organised fashion. At last they had found their prize, and Chris had to give the French generals credit. These barracks were perfectly well hidden. They began the dangerous descent slowly, and after a period of gingerly climbing backwards down the steep slope, they used branches of the trees for support and passed their rucksacks from one to the other. Chris Aston and Thomas Fisher finally reached the foot of the mountain. From here, the expanse of the plain loomed even larger than it had done from above, and now they had to trek right across its length. As they began to walk across the hard ground, the gates of the barracks loomed up before them, tall and black against the blue of the sky. The whole area was heavily fortified. Chris had guessed it would be, but what they hadn't realised was the extent of the fortifications. The metal fencing stretched far into the distance, both to the left and the right, and it was topped by thick coils of barbed wire. This fence was impossible to climb. Lucky then that the soldiers did not have to. The guard on duty at the foot of the gates looked bored. He leaned heavily against a wooden post. For a while he remained in that position, unaware of the soldiers who were now making their way towards him. Chris and Thomas found this highly amusing, and when the guard finally saw their approach, they were surprised to see him stand bolt upright with his gun positioned over his right shoulder as he saluted. "He knows we're soldiers then," Chris whispered as they followed forwards. Thomas nodded in agreement and they both smiled. The French barracks may have looked impressive, but the soldiers appeared to be less so. 5 minutes later, through the first gate and past the officers' car park, Thomas was sent in one direction while Chris was shoehorned into another, a young soldier leading the way. He felt no animosity about this. They must have been split by rank. He was a staff sergeant and Thomas a mere private. In any case, the old man had told the communications officer their names and their rank in advance. It was an informed decision. Chris passed offices, bunkhouses, and then a cafeteria before reaching an open green space. There, the soldier who had been leading the way saluted to Chris and headed off to the right. Chris felt sure he could get used to everyone saluting him. It made him feel important. Across the grass there was an opening between two trees, through which he could see Thomas being introduced to other soldiers. They were kicking a football from one to another, and it didn't take long for Thomas to become involved. Oh, Chris smiled. At least his friends seemed to be happier now. He decided that he needed to find the centre of activity. That way he could inquire about Colonel Smith's French counterpart, the man in charge, and then, with that out of the way, he could start to look for Ewan and Jennifer. He would keep his promise, that much was certain. Ahead of him the path ended at a muddy field, and to the left there was a large concrete expanse, a parade ground. It would be silly to head back the way that he had come, so the best option appeared to be branching off to the right, in the same direction as his guide had disappeared. At first his chosen route lay ahead in a straight line, but soon more buildings appeared and Chris began to take time to look around him. The path was narrow, and where there had been grass on either side of him, there was now tarmac. Red brick structures stretched out along the length of the pathway. These were the newer buildings. He could tell they had received considerable investment. They had large, double-glazed windows and blinds that hid whatever lay inside, while the door to each building had its own primary colour, so that taken together, a rainbow stretched out before him. Well, the French are famed for their artistic tendencies, Chris laughed as he contemplated the thought. Now the new tarmac gave way to a gravel path. Chris began to kick his heels, propelling small shards of the stone across the grass. To his left, he had reached the end of the smart buildings and was now greeted by a wire fence marked with a bold notice. He read it with interest and didn't notice as another person walked up behind him. He read, "Training ground. Grade 4 personnel only. Proceed only when accompanied by a registered professional." Suddenly, a cold hand caught the side of his neck, and Chris thought for a moment that he was about to be throttled. He jumped round in surprise. "Are you Staff Sergeant Aston?" The voice was low and deep, the kind Chris might have expected from a soldier who had undertaken many a dangerous mission. "That's me," Chris replied hoarsely. He took on a dismissive tone and immediately went into a defensive mode, looking the man up and down. The man wore a uniform just like his own, United Forces. His hair was thick and black and combed away from his face in a style that was popular in the 1930s. He had the French Forces emblem pinned to his chest, and the United European Medal took pride of place on his top pocket. He looked sinister and could have easily passed as a member of the old Italian mafia. "Well, Staff Sergeant Aston," the man breathed long and deep, "our soldier should have warned you not to stray." The man stopped for a moment, looked his prey up and down, and then added, "especially into the private quarters." Chris smiled uncomfortably, where he stood and leaned back on the alleyway between the two buildings. I didn't know," he said finally, knowing better than to launch into an argument. "We are all soldiers here, and I thought I was left to get my bearings alone." The man's stare never faltered, and it hit Chris The man's stare never faltered, and it hit Chris and bored down to the root of his soul. "Be that as it may," he wheezed, his voice dropping even deeper than Chris had thought possible, "I see it as taking liberties, considering you're a guest here. If you were under my command, I would be overseeing your discipline for this matter." Chris winced and leaned back against the wire fence again. He was not used to this, someone questioning his authority. But, the man said finally, looking away and glancing further down the alleyway, the Major General thinks differently to me, and I have to respect his views. He's asked me to come and find you and to take you to the private quarters for a meeting. However, looking at the state of your uniform, Staff Sergeant, I think we'd better make a diversion to the storeroom first. And with that, the man paced off briskly back towards the crossroads. Occasionally he glanced over his shoulder to check that Chris was still there, following like a dog on a lead, and soon enough, both captor and prey disappeared around the corner and out of sight. So that's chapter 13 of Walking on Cinders, my novel. It's 10 years old this year, and I'll be back tomorrow with chapter 14. I hope you can join me then.